Good evening, everyone. My name is John Toews, no relation, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to the launch of Island Falls by Owen Toews, to which you may applaud. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are delighted to have you here tonight, both in person and virtually on this beautiful spring day for this incredible book launch. And this is a truly incredible book. No one is here to listen to me gab, so I will not take up much of your time. Suffice it to say that this is an unbelievably good book, and I'm so excited to hear more from the book itself and also to hear more from the author during the conversation. We're very grateful to ARP Books, one of Canada's foremost publishers and one that we're lucky to have based here in Winnipeg, for publishing this book in the first place and for making this evening a possibility. So just a few quick words about procedure. There will be a reading from this podium, and then there'll be a conversation that'll take place to my left. We'll be eschewing a Q&A for this evening, but if you do have any hard questions to put to Owen at the signing table, please feel free to do so. If you are one of those folks watching live on YouTube, you can feel free to fill the chat with positive comments that we will then pass along to the author immediately afterward. In Island Falls, a nested novella, a university student becomes intrigued by a mysterious friend whose intimate relationship with the history of the mill town where he grew up, Island Falls, becomes an object of both fascination and curiosity. The book sketches an inquiry into responsibility and reflection that is also a map repeated infinitely within capitalist geographies and personal histories of occupation, exploitation, and decline. There can be a tendency to describe such a work as experimental, but instead Island Falls is executed with such grace, confidence, and certainty that I can't imagine it personally in any other form. There's something about the text that invites the reader to an intimate level of immersion and almost collaboration with the work itself. Or in the words of a much more elegant thinker than myself, Jenny Heischen-Wills, it is a book that pushes its reader's understanding of form, genre, narrative, and characterization. She goes on to say that a moment takes as speaker forced me to stop, consider how and why we write, but also how and why we read, record, notice, and coexist. And what higher praise could there be for any other book? Owen Toews was born in Winnipeg in 1986 and is descended from Russian Mennonites. He was trained as a geographer at the City University of New York Graduate Center and is the author of the award-winning work of nonfiction, Stolen City, Racial Capitalism and the Making of Winnipeg, also published by ARP. He lives here in Winnipeg. Your host for this evening, Irene Bindi, is an artist and an editor at ARP Books, based in Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg. She is the co-editor with Stephen Broomer of Exovede in the Darkroom, the films of Rain Vermette, also published by ARP. And I'm always loath to leave her typically humble bio at this, as if you've been interested in or involved in film, art, music, literature, or activism within the city, you're likely aware of her immense contribution to Winnipeg and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Owen Toews.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really great to see you all. I have notes on my phone. I hope you'll forgive me for that. First of all, I want to thank ARP for publishing the book, and Irene especially for editing the book and believing in it and wanting to publish it. And thanks to McNally Robinson for having us. Thanks, John, for that lovely introduction. Thank you also to Brett for the beautiful cover of the book, and to Todd and Andrew at ARP. So I wanted to say a little bit about me. I took a writing workshop with Duncan Mercredi, who's I'm happy to see is here tonight, a few years ago, and he taught us to introduce ourselves by saying who our grandparents are. So I want to do that real quick. One of my grandparents is here. Her name's Elvira Toews. All my grandparents were descended from Mennonites who migrated to southern Manitoba from Russia in the late 19th century. And Elvira was a nurse and a social worker and a family therapist. And I have some other things written down about her. She's a really she's a really good listener. And she's interested in what makes people tick, is how she would put it, I think. So I hope that I learned a little bit of that from her. She's also quite a rebellious person, and she'll be the first person to call out a power tripper, and to disobey an unjust law or rule or recommendation. My other grandmother, Irene Rempel, can't be here today because she passed away a few years ago. She was a teacher. She worked in international development. She was a community organizer. She was a single mother of 4 boys. And among other things, she loved third world revolutionaries, Castro, Che Guevara, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane. And I'll always remember on our Saturday garage sale trips, we can't fill up at the Shell on Sherbrooke and Broadway because of Shell's investment in apartheid South Africa. So she was a super political, radical, amazing woman, and I'm lucky to have known her. My grandfathers, Melvin, Elvira's late husband, was a beloved school teacher in Steinbach, a 6th grade history teacher. He made history come alive for those 6th graders in Steinbach in a way I think nobody else ever did. And everyone loved him for it and appreciated that. And then my other grandfather I never met, he died before I was born. His name is Johnny Rempel. I don't know that much about him. Maybe my dad's here tonight, but he could tell you about him maybe later. He was a construction contractor. He worked on the floodway and the perimeter highway here in Winnipeg. Anyway, I'll move on now and talk about this book, Island Falls. So I worked on this book from 2018 to 2023 while I was living in Winnipeg. It started as a research project that was funded by a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alberta. I was looking at this sort of at racism and economies of towns in Manitoba and the way that they were structured and put together. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that later on, about that research process. But then I kept working on it for a long time. I was trying out different forms and genres. So that's why it's a little bit, the final product is like kind of mixed up a little bit. But like Jenny Hagen Will's quote is such a generous reading of that mixed upness. We'll just go with that, I think. And then, so I was working, so for like, after that money ran out from the University of Alberta, I worked part-time at the Winnipeg Public Library at ARP Books, and teaching here and there at sessional work, doing sessional work at the University of Winnipeg, and also, of course, making a home and raising our daughters with my companion, Bronwyn Dobchuk-Land, who's a brilliant professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg and a fierce abolitionist activist in the city. Like every book, though, this one has social and political origins and aims. I think at this point, if I can speak for all of us in this country, I think we're all trying to understand. Sorry, I'm gonna take your water, Irene, and then you can have mine.
Do you have
Oh, do I? Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks. I have. Is this yours, John?
No, that's
Okay. I do think that all of us are trying to understand the living history of this country. I think that all of us in different ways are struck by the violence and the disregard and the creepiness of the capitalist world. I think that everybody in this country has come to realize that the full truth about this place and this economic system has been concealed from us. And we see this like everywhere in the city, I assume across the country, in people's windows, on people's fences, on walls. we see the indications of this, right? The last 5 years, speaking a little bit about the context that I was writing this book within, have been years of incredible revolt against capitalist violence, from Wet'suwet'en to Kamloops to Minneapolis and beyond. And in Winnipeg specifically, these have been years marked by the courage of the families and communities of people lost to police and vigilante violence. Errol Green, Mature Madu, Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, Stuart Andrews, William Amo, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Moran, and many, many more, as we know. And we know those names because of the courage of their families and their communities, right? Otherwise, we don't. There are many more people whose names we don't know. And so that spirit of resistance and revolt and regard, right? I've been thinking about, anyway, this. I think it was in Christina Sharp's book, Ordinary Notes. She's using this word regard. I've been thinking about this. In this spirit and in these political times that I was writing Island Falls, and intending it hopefully for many people, but especially I think people who are able to think about a shared future beyond capitalism and beyond Western civilization. I think we can do it. So the book itself, it's very short, and it's 122 pages, and there are 13 photographs. So it's divided into 7 sections. They alternate. There's 2 kinds of sections. There are 4 Jan sections set in New York City and narrated by an unnamed friend of Jan's, and 3 report sections, I guess Irene and I have been calling them. These sections are written by Jan himself and set in Island Falls, which is a fictional mill town somewhere in the Canadian West. So the unnamed narrator is trying to figure out his friend, who he's very fond of, but is a bit of an oddball. And his friend Jan is trying to figure out his hometown. So Jan's trying to think about how we're made to relate to each other under capitalism. He's trying to think about the way social and geographical partitions produce feelings that shore up or undermine those same partitions. Jan's trying to make sense of what the mill town where he grew up took from him and what it took from others around him who were differently positioned within it. He thinks about these experiences not as identical, but as resembling each other as being part of the same larger structure. He's trying to understand how the mill works, how every part of it is implicated in every other part. He's trying to figure out something about the ethics and politics of storytelling, of how one might go about resisting both colonial silences and colonial acquisitiveness at the same time. And finally, Jan's trying to think about how atrocity, and I know, and it feels a little bit inappropriate to talk about colonialism and capitalism and violence and history without talking about Palestine at this time. I don't want to make any kind of shallow comparison, but just to say, I think that the shared themes here are thinking through resistance to a situation of a country or a place that is defined by land theft, apartheid, and genocide. But Jan is trying to think about the ways that atrocity, right? So the kind of atrocities that we're all thinking about these days are part of, not apart from, the more ordinary workings of capitalism, the more day-to-day activities. And how atrocity is one part of a more complex institution and can't be divorced of that more complex quotidian institution. He's trying to think about the system that produces atrocity, how the other things it produces are contingent on or complicit with atrocity, and how leaving the system intact, even when the atrocity might have been paused or abolished or disavowed, perpetually leaves open the possibility of new atrocities. Okay, so this is my explanation of the book, or introduction of it. Now I'm going to read a little bit from it, from the beginning of the book. The first time I hung out with Jan, which he pronounced in the German or Czech way, Jan, was in a park in an unbranded part of Manhattan that I would never have visited otherwise, and that I've not visited since, as far as I know. A place that, looking back, I have never been able to pinpoint in my imagination. Jan's name, which I learned on the morning of our first meeting, gave me a good feeling right off the bat, because I had a dear friend named Jan who was Czech and pronounced it the same way, who made bombs and other electrical devices with me in his basement all day long, every day one summer before we drifted apart for good in 7th grade. The other thing that attracted me to Jan was his appearance. He was tall, with gorgeous red hair, a ghost-like complexion, piercing incisors, and although he was young, a few years younger than me at least, he had prematurely lost almost all of the hair on top of his head, but nevertheless grew it out long in the back, reminding me of the manic loser in There's Something About Mary. When I arrived, Jan was playing basketball with 2 wiry women, each with short jet black hair, who he introduced to me with an uncertain, almost embarrassed smile as Marisol and Esther. The 4 of us, and at one point a bunch of neighborhood kids too, played a couple of games, laughing and horsing around. Jan was by far the best of all of us. The way he moved on the court was like nothing I had seen before, like a garter snake navigating the walls of a house. Whereas my style was more like a rat trapped in the ceiling. And the way Marisol and Esther played, they did play like one another. It was like bulldogs at a gas station. We continued until, in the late heat of the day, we'd had enough and sat together on the grass, gulping down water and enjoying the sunshine. I asked Marisol, who happened to be sitting next to me, how she and Jan knew each other. Marisol and Esther laughed. The app, said Marisol, smiling. What app? I asked, confused. Marisol explained that the 3 of them were users of a kind of friendship app where people invited total strangers to join them in fun, harmless activities. Later, Jan invited the 3 of us to his apartment. It was in a nondescript high-rise nearby, a place that looked like an office building, but that it seemed had been converted into a rooming house or a sort of college dorm that anyone, not only students, I mean, was eligible to live in. Jan led us out of the elevator onto a floor with one seemingly infinite hallway. There must have been at least 50 doors leading from it, and shared bathrooms at either end. Despite being filled with the aroma of 50 spicy home-cooked meals and the sounds of 50 zany TV shows, the place had an antiseptic feel to it. It was freshly drywalled and tiled with hospital-style floors. In fact, there was a woman in a smock cleaning the floor at the time of our visit. Inside Jan's one-room suite, which the 4 of us barely squeezed into, were the most basic furnishings: a loft bed, desk, chair, hot plate, closet, and miniature fridge. A small window looked onto the roof of the building next door. I had never known anyone who lived like this, in the mostly empty room of a civilian dormitory, spending time with friends he had just met that day on an app and might never see again. Everything felt as if Jan had been fresh born that day. Jan was bashful and at the same time not at all bashful about his apartment as he showed us in. He laughed and shrugged his shoulders. This is it. Marisol, Jan, and I lounged on the floor. Esther took the chair and we passed around a bottle of bourbon. We talked about our lives. Marisol recounted leaving Puerto Rico as a teenager to become an architect in the United States, and more recently leaving architecture to become a sculptor in New York, which she was now considering leaving to become a nurse wherever she could get on. Esther had left El Salvador to become a scientist, the exact mysterious word she used, in Texas, and had remained one, now working in a lab in New York. Marisol and Esther spoke at length about their hometowns, both beautiful coastal villages they missed very much, but also, of course, despised. And then Jan spoke about his hometown, a town he too both loved, though I'm not sure he said that he missed it and despised. A real live company town, the last company town left on Turtle Island, as Jan put it. A quirky little egg-shaped village superimposed onto an Indian reservation in the Canadian wilderness. It was Island Falls, Manitoba. That was the name of his hometown, I think. Although it could just as easily have been Island Falls, Alberta, or Island Falls, Saskatchewan. That had its hooks in Jan, that possessed him, and it was his preoccupation with Island Falls, I soon realized, that brought Jan to New York, to the program, and to me that beautiful round autumn. Just gonna skip ahead a little bit. I was in 2 workshops with Jan that fall. Both of them convened in a circle of chairs set up in the basement of an abandoned department store in Koreatown. The small Marxist program we were in had been hatched one drunken night, perhaps an act of blackmail, it was speculated, by 2 communist professors and the university president who happened to have become drinking buddies, and as a result, likely due to feelings of regret on the part of the president, was relegated to basements, attics, and inhospitable rooms at the end of long, dark hallways. One of the workshops was led by Syl Irving, our would-be mentor, probably the would-be mentor of more than half of us, an American communist who in her youth had been a theater actor. The other was led by Juniper Sharma, a young woman from a prominent family of Indian communists, so I heard. On the first day of Syl's workshop, Jan, introducing himself, told us he was working on an ethnography of masculinity and exercise in outdoor public spaces. In the other, he told the group he was working on an ethnography of race and ethnicity in online originating relationships. Both of these projects, I know now, were bullshit. In fact, only a few days later in the office we all shared, cramped, windowless, a fluorescent lit room in the former department store, decorated with an upside down map of Latin America as seen from Cuba, a fuck work poster and a stop snitching poster, a French print from May 68, I think, showing a woman with a finger to her lips. I found something in the printer that I was sure must be Jan's writing. That's where I'm gonna leave it.
Thank you. Yes, okay. You can hear me. Thanks, Owen. Thanks for working with ARP again. I guess people have already gathered based on Owen's introduction that this is sort of like a deceptively small receptacle in terms of the ideas that it contains. But maybe we can just start by having you explain a little bit about the research that you did in rural Manitoba that led to the part of the story that you haven't read from in terms of the structure, which is like the report part, the more clinical, descriptive part of the Milltown, and then your reasons for like allegorizing that research.
Yeah. Thanks, Irene. So I traveled from town to town, asking people, like starting with, I think it was my friend Jack that I kind of tipped me off about how to do this kind of research. But like, you know, in every town there are certain people that take it upon themselves to learn the history or to know about the history of that town, and often it would be people at local newspapers or at the local museum that I would get in touch with, and then they would introduce me to that person, you know, who may or may not have self-published 10 books about the town. Amazing people. You know, basically like I'm the same way, right? Kindred spirits. So I was interested in how towns were set up around specific industries, racially and geographically. And I was struck, so I'm a city person, like I don't know anything about small towns really. So I was really genuinely curious, like how these places were set up, and naive, I guess, in a way that was helpful probably. Like I could come to it with very few preconceptions. So it was just striking, like the way, you know, like these very clear partitions, like between you know, like the good part of town and the not so good part of town, and who the company is taking care of and maintaining and providing infrastructure to, and who the company is not, and how this falls along racial lines, of course, right? Like, and so that's what I did. And I just sat and talked with people and walked around and took pictures. And then the allegory, and then so like I wrote about, and then I ended up writing about one fictional town that kind of was combining at different aspects of these different towns. And then I was never intending to write it as fiction, but like I was getting really frustrated, right? Just like trying attempt after attempt after attempt. And then I just was like, I sat down and I decided to just try to write as simply as I could about what I thought was going on. And that came out like in a fictional way, because there were certain like truths about the way that I understood things, like that were not strictly factual, but it was to put it down in the briefest way possible. It came out in a fictional way.
So, I mean, in light of that, I mean, you said that there was like, you know, it's you don't want to draw a shallow comparison with what is happening right now in Palestine, but I think in terms of that allegorizing, it makes the narrative, it gives the narrative a very broad scope, and there's many ways. I was, you know, rereading this afternoon that were striking because of those structures being repeated along racial lines, as you say, through capitalism globally. Sorry, I just have to keep opening my notes again. I also beg forgiveness for using my notes. There's sort of like, sorry, in like an earlier draft, you had in the description of the friendships in the friendship narrative, some references, because they're students, they're working together, and they're sort of developing like kind of their political understanding in conjunction with one another. And I'm interested in that kind of like intersection of the political and the social that emerges there. And then also how, you know, I don't want to give too much away about the book to people who haven't read it, but there's another, there's the two narrative layers, but there's kind of a third narrative layer as well that is introduced by this moment between the two characters. It could be like understood as a type of betrayal that opens up another narrative, and that other narrative raises questions about stories and whose stories are being told. Not a new question, but one that adds another dimension to the question of friendships and boundaries and political realities. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question, Irene. Like, I think one thing that came up as important in writing it was that, and again, it's so short, and the characters, the relationships are not like developed at any kind of length, but it's felt like important to have other people come into the narrative actually beyond Jan and the narrator. So there are times when there are other people from other places, both within the United States and elsewhere. And there's a real, I think through these friendships and relationships, like there does, and this is how it kind of, I feel like, how this kind of thing has happened for me is like, there's this kind of internationalism, this politics of internationalism that comes through socially, right? Through understanding, like from people from very disparate places and parts of the world and parts of this continent, like coming together to try to understand those places and bringing a kind of radical politics that come from the struggles of those those different places and people coming together and seeing the similarities between places that you might not otherwise have seen as similar, and making those like to me that is a very social process. I mean, yeah, like it's there was something else I was thinking of with your question. In terms of like the ethics of storytelling, like this is also something that I was struggling with too, because there are, of course, like in the process of writing fiction, which was new to me, like things just, you know, come into your head, and then this is the proof, like people are struggling with this, right? Like, of course, I've struggled with it forever, but where people you care about, like, there's the stories of the people you care about are always like with you, but it's not for you to tell their story. So this comes up in the book, where Jan's friend is sort of coming to Jan's defense a little bit, in the context of like his writing being unusual and unconventional, and trying to think about what Jan is up to when he's writing this kind of like diagram or anatomy of the mill. And the conclusion that he comes to is that there are these stories that Jan is carrying with him and are influencing his thinking, but he's, instead of telling those stories, which aren't his stories, he's trying to think about the place as a whole, and the way that every place is implicated in every other place. And that's his kind of way through that question, for better or worse.
In an earlier version, you had characters referencing some of the things that they were studying, names of scholars and books and things, and you decided to kind of excise all of that at a certain point. Not that there was a ton of it in the first place, but one exception being a couple of epigraphs to the Milltown report segments that are by Black Marxists, W.E.B. Du Bois and Senator Robinson, and I'm curious about that choice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so there's two quotes. Like the first quote from Du Bois is like about he's talking about how it's not the terms are like 100 years old, so they don't roll off the tongue, but like it's not. The people sort of like running the world, or the most oppressive forces in the world, are not the aristocratic monopoly, but the democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. And this is this unity of capital and labor was really powerful to me, like in thinking through some of the dynamics of these towns, in the sense of like what do you say about a union in a town that didn't go on strike for 75 years? Like, what's going on with that union, right? Like why does the union leadership like drinking with the bosses every Saturday night? Why are they living? Why is the union leadership like, and the bosses on like on the top, living in the best homes? Why is like why is the anyway, all sorts of there is a litany of issues, right, that the union never, in this book, like never addresses, right? Because there's this unity of white labor and capital against everyone else, right? And this is the way that I think many of us see things today in this country, where unions are very they don't actually care about it, like, anyway. They tolerate a lot of bullshit, like, yeah, I appreciated like anyway, Red Braid, which put out a book with ARP a few weeks ago or months. Yeah, anyway, where they're using this term of like labor aristocracy, right? Anyway, how do we get on that? You asked about, right, so this is the Du Bois quote. And when I saw that quote from Du Bois, that's just brilliant. And it makes so much sense. And because it's not just talking about white supremacy, but of like the way that whiteness is suturing together labor and capital against most of the working people of the world. And then the other quote which is from Cedric Robinson. So I don't know if this, I think this book is kind of infused with like, at one point I just read, I was so confused and at loose ends trying to write the stuff or whatever. I just like, at one point I just started reading like Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, which I had already read, and then like really just like typing out a lot of it and then like going to the thesaurus and like trying to like come out like almost like in a trance, kind of like rework Cedric Robinson's sentences and word choices, because his word choices are so interesting and poetic already. And then I was just like riffing on them like with the thesaurus, like to try to like generate new readings out of it or try to like broaden it out and just sit with it and absorb it and think about it. And then this quote, this one quote from Black Marxism is about the rumblings. Robinson is talking about the rumblings of the degenerating mechanism becoming louder and louder, right? And this is, I feel like, a very evocative kind of poetic description, I mean, of a society with a lot of contradictions, right? That are, and this, anyway, so I thought about this idea of rumblings, and then I had a whole section of like all the rumblings, right? Whether it's the poison in the water, or whether it's the apartheid, geography of the mill, or all kinds of things like these rumblings and contradictions getting louder and louder and more pronounced and irrepressible. And the other part of that quote is Robinson is saying that the rumblings can be heard above like I think he calls it like technological wizardry, which of course is like the circuses kind of like of capitalism, which are quite entertaining sometimes, but still are not able to drown out the rumblings.
I'm sure many people know that you're a geographer, and the sort of the way that you approach the boundary making. It seems, like that's the format by which the town is described. And there's like so many powerful descriptions of the way that power is wielded through the sort of physical demarcation. There's this very wrenching section that describes how the ground is being marked and measured and carefully delineated for the preparation of these lots, the building of these houses that have been promised to the residents in exchange for giving up land rights. And as time passes and, the sagging twine, I don't remember exactly how you've described it, but along these sticks of demarcation, just kind of aging with the seasons, and the people kind of start to give up that dream. I think you call it, they just start to forget. And so the way that marked and promised spaces, wherever they are, like is used to keep people in line with the hope of something that will never materializes, seems to be like this very potent synthesis of the promises of both capitalism and colonialism, and as well as a demonstration, of the interwovenness of them. I think you've already talked about the capitalist allegory as it manifests in the mill town, but maybe I don't know, do you want to read a section from the more clinical, or I could, with your permission, or not, we could just avoid it. But it is, one of the things that struck me today was the 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 forced assimilation camp of the northern quarter. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I wanted to talk because the book goes into a sort of like a modern day moment of the mill town, right? Which I think maybe that would interest people, or it's not all historical. So just in terms of thinking about, okay, so one thing I'm thinking about when you're talking about these promised houses and that don't get built. And something I was really interested in looking at and asking people about the history of their towns was like, where did the infrastructure go and not go, right? Like who had running water and who didn't, just like that simple. And it's amazing. I mean, I don't know, like I'm naive, like I said before, like I don't know that much about life outside of the city, but it's quite amazing like how recently, right? Like people got running water actually in this country, in Manitoba. People, of course, many people don't have it. How recently, like people have had gas furnaces, electricity, and so forth. It's actually really fun. Like this is a kind of a small tangent, but like Manitoba Hydro had to convince people to use electricity. Like people didn't really want it at first. In a lot of places, of course, in a lot of places, I guess people saw the benefits, but people were like used to what they were doing. Anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. I would actually like to learn more about that. They're like selling these appliances, right? Because they wanted people to buy stoves and fridges and whatnot. But people were like, it's kind of expensive and it's not really worth it. So anyway, but like the question of where the infrastructure goes is like so clearly marked along race and class lines, right? Like, so that's really easy. And this is, of course, something that the union is never interested in addressing. Like, why do half the workers in this mill not have running water, right? And I think, like, I don't know if this is really developed very well in the book, but like, it's a very gendered question, right? Like, because who's hauling the water and doing the laundry and the cooking, etc. Like, the union leaders don't give a fuck about that, really. This is like the patriarchy of the wage, like unwaged housework never factors into their calculations. And so, but in terms of like writing as a geographer, like I want to really emphasize the like dialectical like aspects of it, of and it's very clear, like in a company town, like the company sets up the town, right? And then immediately there is a little bit of a contradiction, because like the people who built the mill, there's actually no plans for them to live in the town, but they're living in the town. So there's immediately like a sort of informal settlement that pops up, and the people are trying to get jobs, but there's actually no plan for those people to be working at the mill, except that sometimes they're incorporated when there is a need for extra labor. Anyway, so you have this like you have this kind of this dialectical unfolding, people creating places, those places like fostering feelings in people about their neighbors. Like the way that these partitions, like between the different parts of town, like create suspicion, like people become suspicious of people who are kept out of their part of the town, simply because those people are kept out of their part of the town, right? Like, because people are like, there must be a reason, and I'm not familiar, and they're odd to me, and they're like, because I don't know, I don't see them, and they're not supposed to be here, and when they're here, they make me uncomfortable. And so the way that spaces are laid out affects like our humanity and the way that we relate to other people. And then those feelings like affect the kind of places that we subsequently plan and the way that we shape the future of our communities. And so like, I'm trying to like walk this line where I don't want to give away the ending or whatever. But like it moves forward, right? Like the mill, like it changes. And but the social relations are what people are, and the values are what some people are trying to change, because what is happening is we're seeing new versions of the mill, the old mill, just reworked in new ways, right? Like as we see in this city and in our society, like this is just kind of what happens, is like when something becomes obsolete, we get a new thing, but the social relations don't change. And this is the geography of it, because the look of the town changes and the old partitions go away, right? Because they're no longer profitable. And then that makes people uncomfortable, and there's a whole new round of vigilantism and state violence. And the same, people who are in a position in the mill are in a position in the new version of the mill, which is a bit different.
Yeah. I mean, this is like exactly what you just described, is those two pages of that one of the mill sections, but yeah, where they're talking about the narrator, this omniscient narrator, is basically just describing, the social exclusion, basically, of this space. The parallel storytelling techniques kind of formalize this affective difference between the firsthand experience, and I think you touched on this before, like not feeling like the ability to relay another's story or whatever. Even when that is the experience of someone who's telling you their own story, and the experience that is relayed through official channels, so the official document being, the king of the format that, governments and media and institutions use, that only like reaffirms and re-legitimizes, reinstates this class imbalance. And so there is something interesting about like using the two, those two formal structures kind of against each other in order to sort of like bring together those logics. I mean,
Yeah.
The structure of the way that the structure of the book does that.
Yeah. Excuse me. That's super interesting. Like, I feel like a little bit like, I don't know, like that might be something that happened like as a not super intentional thing, like that just kind of, maybe hopefully it works, or it just kind of arose. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
No, that's okay, I'm drawing many blanks.
Yeah, but like the question of writing, is part of this, like a big part of the book, like of genre and form, and what to do. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it is a really, like, as John was saying, immersive experience to move between these two narrative spaces back and forth. And there is like this very warm and like this sweetness to the story of the friendships of the friends in New York, and in Jan's telling of his own stories, all of the inequities that you see reflected in the mill, in the report segments. You sort of like, there is this, you feel the formal shift very intensely, but this sort of like warmth still runs through, because there's these feelings, this sort of like, the lingering thread is this like, it's very human.
Yeah, and I mean, because like I did like write a nonfiction book that before this that didn't have any of that real like fictional sweetness in it. So I do hope that the more narrative parts in this friendship and getting to know Jan like infuses the more like clinical sort of report in it. Yeah, like you're saying. I really hope so. And back to like what you were talking about, friendship and politics. Like Jan is a character like I think is really like you know, like he's not very experienced like politically, like he's learning from his friends, like you mentioned. And I think that the narrator, his friend, and you know, is helping him along. Even though he's like kind of betraying him at the same time.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting things is this sort of like strange, like there's the narrator is really like obsessed with Jan in a way. But the sort of like the nature of that obsession is some kind of love that's not like defined. And then the betrayal itself he acknowledges, but repeats, like, and I think for the sake of knowledge, you know, it brings up this question of like revealing truth and how, you know, sometimes there's always some kind of betrayal that has to happen in truth telling, or something that is perceived as betrayal from a certain context, but otherwise not. I have to talk in the abstract about a book that people haven't read, but yeah. Anyway.
It's like, yeah, to be fond of somebody and curious about them is like an interesting thing. Like, and like trying to, I don't know, like, have you ever? Yeah, I don't know. See, I don't know how to talk about fiction either. Like, maybe I'll learn. But yeah, like, have you ever been liked someone but kind of wonder like what their deal is? That's going on. And this issue of trust goes. Because there are moments, maybe it's pretty subtle in the book where like the narrator and their friends and comrades are like wondering if they can trust Jan because he's not seasoned, you know, like in that way, in that kind of activist way. He's like an oddball, and they're wondering if they can trust him. So I think that the narrator like kind of. Yeah, like going beyond these privacy boundaries might have something to do with that. The kids have to go to bed.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk more.
Yeah. As John said, Owen will be around if people have direct questions. Thank you for coming. Keep calling your MP and telling them to call for a ceasefire and keep showing up for Palestine and for everyone. Thank you. Thanks again, Owen, for working with ARP, and everyone for coming on a miserable night.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much to both of you for that reading, Owen, and for the conversation, Irene. We will be moving along to the signing portion of the evening, and I'll have some scintillating instructions for you in just a moment. I'm just going to be indulgent for one moment because I know there are a number of people in this crowd concerned with aesthetics and sound, and I do apologize for the shape of Owen's microphone cable. It's been bothering me all evening. So we will be moving on to the signing. We'll just ask you to give us one moment to remain in your places while we safely transport Owen to a table just beside the cash desk. Following that, you'll be able to get in line to get books signed. In a spirit of sadly naked capitalism here at the bookstore, we would ask that you pay for the book at some point this evening, but if you would like to get it signed before you do so, please feel free. Island Falls is an exceptional book. I'm so excited for those of you who have not read it to encounter it, and would just like to ask you to join me one more time in thanking Irene Bindi and Owen Toews.